So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's presentation. It's the NYU CUSP Fall Seminar Series, and today we are very excited to have Ms. Jennifer Pomerantz. Ms. Jennifer Pomerantz is an assistant professor in the New York University School of Global Public Health. Her research focuses on public health law and policy, and is especially interested in policy and legal options to address products that cause harm, the food environment, and social injustices that lead to health disparities. Ms. Pomerantz is also one of the nation's leading public health scholars on the legal tool of preemption. She has 2 books. She's the first author of the upcoming textbook, Public Health Law in Practice, to be published by Oxford University Press in 2023, and authored the book Food Law for Public Health, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. She has also over 100 articles in various journal types on legal opportunities and barriers to enacting public health policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Ms. Pomerantz earned her Juris Doctorate from Cornell Law School and her Master of Public Health from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And today she will be talking about preemption of local public health policies. Let's give a warm round of applause, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was very sweet. I am going to be speaking about preemption of local public health policies. I'm happy to be here, and I will get started. Okay. Always this happens, right? You can't advance your slide. Okay. So I will give you a lot of background information and definitions, so we're all on the same page. But first, I'll identify the structure of U.S. government and define preemption, and then we'll examine preemption in public health areas. So the concept of federalism is how the U.S. government is structured. The U.S. Constitution establishes the federal government and the states as separate sovereigns. The states joined the United States with certain authorities, and then the federal government's authorities are established in the Constitution and set forth there. But what's interesting is local governments are not mentioned in the Constitution. And why is this? It's because all local governments are created by the state. So the states create and decide how much authority they want to give to their local governments. And also because of that, there's great diversity across states on how much local control the local governments have. But also sometimes within states, there's diversity because often states grant their largest city different authorities than they grant to the rest of their municipalities. So local governments across the United States and within states have a great diverse range of powers. But it's important to note that all have some type of authority, but the state legislator always retains some type of control. And this is also through even amending the state constitution if they're not happy with the authority that they gave to a local government, or as we'll talk about in a minute, preemption. But before we get to preemption, or even as a concept or as a government tool, there has to either be a grant of authority or no grant of authority. So local municipal governments can usually act on different types of issues. Sometimes they have the authority to tax, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can hire their own personnel, sometimes they can't. Sometimes they have the authority to enact public health regulations, and sometimes they don't. For the most part, they do have multiple authorities. And then what happens is they cannot always act if they don't have the authority, or sometimes the states come in and preempt them. And that's the topic that we'll be getting into now. So preemption is when a higher level of government withdraws or limits the authority of a lower level of government to act. My talk today will be focusing on state preemption, but I want to explain this to you in the context of the overall federal and state governments. So the 2 terms that we don't actually use in practice, but you might see them, are ceiling preemption and floor preemption. Ceiling preemption is what public health lawyers mean when we talk about preemption. It's when the higher level of government sets maximum standards that the lower level of government cannot exceed. So this creates uniformity at that higher level of government, and the lower levels of government can't make any type of law that would be different than the either federal or state law. And I'm going to give you examples to put this into more practical concept. The other term is called floor preemption, but we don't like that term because it's confusing and people think that it's not, we wouldn't even consider it preemption. It's really minimum standards. So this is something that we favor in public health. Minimum standards provides a standard that every entity must meet, and then the local governments, usually in the case, can go beyond the floor, beyond the minimum standards, and provide more protection to their communities. And the same for state and for federal. This often allows for local innovation and additional protections, and a lot of times communities, especially urban areas where it's densely populated and they have a greater need for additional laws, they can go beyond whatever the state or federal government provide and provide additional protections. Two major successes that use floor preemption or minimum standards is the Federal Civil Rights Act. The federal law provides protections for an established set of individuals against discrimination, and then it allows state and local governments to provide additional protections. Similarly, the National School Lunch Program has minimum nutritional standards, and then it allows for state and local governments to provide additional nutrition standards so they can have healthier school lunches. So these are examples of minimum standards. We all support it. It's great. That's not the issue, and that's not what really preemption is. Preemption is ceiling preemption, and that's what I'll be focusing on now. The Institute of Medicine, which is now called the National Academies of Science, they also say that whenever possible, the federal and state governments should enact minimum standards to allow state and local governments to protect health and safety of their inhabitants. And so that's a positive thing and not the concern. So here's an example of federal law. The federal government is always if their law conflicts with state or local law, the federal law is always supreme, meaning that it's in the Constitution, the federal law is supreme. So it's very common for there to be federal standards. And a lot of times it really just makes sense too. Like we have federal aviation laws. We need the federal government to establish there's no smoking on airplanes. It couldn't be that every time an airplane crossed a state that they had different smoking laws. That would make no sense. So, federal preemption makes sense in the context of these types of laws where we haven't needed a national standard. It's good for business and it's good for public health. An example where we've come to accept federal preemption as very common is labeling. Again, it would be very difficult for businesses to do business in all 50 states if all 50 states had different labeling laws. So we have federal labeling requirements and they preempt state and local changes to these. Makes sense from both a business and public health perspective. But what we're seeing is state preemption is functioning completely differently. So states have a much broader authority to preempt local control because local governments are creation of the state. So if the state wants, it could actually even shut down a local government. It could decide that the local government could cease to exist. So knowing that, now you understand that they can preempt the local government from doing anything it wants. It can either be set forth in their state constitution or in state statutes. The state legislator may value uniformity, statewide standards, state control. It's usually goes well beyond this. This is kind of the glorified version of state preemption of why it's wanted, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what's really going on. So preemption is a tool. Preemption could be used for good, it could be used for bad, and I use that really very much in quotes, like people who support public health and social justice might appreciate the example I'm about to show of preemption for good, but it's only a legal tool. Unfortunately, it's been usually used not in a way that supports public health and social justice. But here is an example where the state of Oregon has decided to become a sanctuary state, so it will not assist the federal government in deporting undocumented immigrants. So this, if you feel that this is a good policy, then this would be like preemption for good. For the very most part, we barely see states use preemption in this way. What we're more seeing is state using preemption to create what we call a regulatory vacuum, where there's absolutely no regulation on the topics preempted. Instead of like where they pass a statewide standard and then they, they're doing something substantive, we're seeing states are just actually withdrawing the authority of local governments from enacting laws and then not acting on their own. So we see this in tobacco, alcohol, food and beverages, firearms, LGBTQ civil rights, plastic bag bans, fire sprinklers, concentrated animal feeding operations, fracking, paid sick leave, and COVID restrictions, many more. There's minimum wage, the list goes on. But what we're seeing are states just taking away the authority of local governments to act and then not acting on their own. So this is really a divide that we see mostly because of a tension between a state legislator that's maybe less progressive and then a more progressive municipality. So that is often why we see preemption, where a state is more conservative and then there's a progressive municipality that wants to provide additional rights or protections, and the state legislator does not like that. The other kind of conflict that creates this tension for preemption is that industries that want to maximize profits, you look on the pictures, these are all industries that are profit industries, then that their interests conflict with communities who want to protect their health and safety. And so the local community cares about health and safety. The state legislators might be happy to support the industries that are creating public health and safety and social justice inequities. So there's these two tensions are often create are also often the result of preemption. Well, create and then are the result of preemption. So here are some examples. So COVID, here are some minimum standards for COVID. Some governors issued statewide stay-at-home orders that served as a regulatory floor. That's the minimum standards we were talking about. But they allowed local governments to enact more protective public health measures based on local conditions. So we like this. We want minimum standards and allow local governments to really address the needs and concerns of their citizens. So in Maryland, some local areas had a slower timeline for reopening based on their COVID numbers. On the other hand, we saw many states that issued statewide orders that preempted municipalities from imposing stricter requirements. And what you'll see in every list of preemption is a lot of times the states are pretty similar. And so here's another example. So automatic fire sprinklers are an incredibly cheap and effective way to minimize both property and life loss during a fire. But in the states that are in red here, these states, the builders associations lobby the states for a law that preempts or prohibits local governments from requiring automatic fire sprinklers in new buildings. So, this is just such low-hanging fruit on such an easy safety measure that it's preempted in these red states from local governments requiring them to be placed in the buildings. Here's an example of food and nutrition policies. So the states in blue, they preempt local governments from implementing various types of nutrition policies, from soda taxes to different type of informational requirements. And they don't at the same time, actually, it's not like the state's not taxing soda or implementing those requirements. They're just creating regulatory vacuum over these topics. The worst case in the country is firearms. So all the states you see in, orange here, dark orange, red, they all preempt local control, including the California, Colorado, and Illinois that are in the middle of the country. Those have a lighter range of preemption. But the only 5 states in America, the ones circled in green, are the only 5 states that do not preempt local control over firearms. So what this means is that local governments cannot enact firearm safety laws in almost the entire country. And the states are not protecting their citizens from firearms accordingly, except really in those 3 states that have the boxes in a different color. So this to me is really one of the scariest areas. And this was, led by the National Rifle Association back in the 80s and 90s. These preemption laws have been in existence for decades. Colorado is actually the only state to ever repeal preemption in the context of firearms. That happened after a shooting in Boulder about a year ago. And it's actually never unheard of to see a repeal in firearms. So this was very exciting. And right after Colorado repealed it, both Boulder and Denver instituted local protections. And then finally, paid sick is a really great example of how states are creating a regulatory vacuum. So paid sick is just a simple, either you require paid sick leave to be provided to employees in your state, or you don't, right? Unfortunately, in terms of employer provided paid sick leave, we definitely know that the employers of higher wage jobs are more likely to provide paid sick leave, and low wage workers are less likely to receive paid sick leave, and definitely racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to receive paid sick leave. So this creates a really big inequity and issue for health disparities, because paid sick leave is associated with much better access and use of health services. And of course, not working while sick and then spreading the sickness. So the states in green all preempt the local governments from requiring paid sick leave. And unless they have a blue star, they also do not require paid sick leave. So this is a really clear example of them creating a regulatory vacuum. There is no required paid sick leave in any state that does not have a blue star. And then you see all these states that are also green, meaning they also preempt local control from requiring paid sick leave. So the blue stars are the states that provide paid sick leave. And then you see some states that have both. This is less problematic if they provide a type of standard. And then if they preempt local control to create uniformity, it's less of a concern than when these other green states that completely just preempt and create a regulatory vacuum in the state. So this is like the clearest example of that. Tobacco control was also the leading area where preemption was passed in the 1980s and 90s. There's only one other success story besides the Colorado firearm repeal, is that in the context of smoke-free air laws, we also saw a repeal in 2000. There were 18 states with the preempted smoke-free air laws. Delaware was the first to repeal, and now only 12 states preempt smoke-free air laws. It's really attributed to how different the smoking is perceived, and also the tobacco industry is perceived. So nobody likes secondhand smoke. So it really does help. The non-smokers' rights movement is very vocal and effective, because a lot of people don't want to be subjected to secondhand smoke when they're indoors, like eating and movie theaters and work. And also the tobacco industry has been demonized, so they're really perceived differently than basically every other industry that has advocated for preemption successfully. Now, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this is that, first of all, I bet many of you have never heard of the term preemption. It's not a well-known term. It's not talked about that much. So most people don't even know what's happening. They don't know that their state has preempted local control, but it also happens behind closed doors. So it's not surprising that this is not a very transparent process, because it's on purpose not transparent. So California preempted local control for sugary beverage taxes, and this photo was leaked that the governor had dinner with the Beverage Association and Pepsi and Coca-Cola right before he signed legislation preempting local control for sugary beverages. So this was a closed door meeting having nothing to do with, government duties. They use misleading frameworks. This was a ballot initiative in Washington state that passed. Yes to affordable groceries on the ballot initiative meant actually yes to preempting local control over soda tax. The soda tax, nobody ever proposes to tax groceries ever anywhere in public health. But the beverage industry reframed the soda tax as taxing affordable groceries, but really just made it the ballot initiative, which they spent millions of dollars on getting signatures on yes to affordable groceries. So that preempted the soda tax in Washington state. The other tactic is to use confusing language. So Kansas has the most broad preemptive law for food policy. It preempts food and nutrition information, consumer incentive items, which actually means like Happy Meal toys. And the really big one that was an issue is food-based health disparities. Food-based health disparities basically can describe literally anything related to food because everything is a food-based health disparity. So what happened was the advocates, especially American Heart Association, they had to work so hard to get a definition or a carve out for food-based health disparities, or else there was concerns that the Kansas was preempting even like supplemental nutrition assistance programs and different nutrition assistance programs from operating in the state. And so they couldn't really dedicate all their resources to fighting preemption. They had to basically fight to get carve outs for these unclear definitions. And so this passed with some type of explanation that it doesn't preempt nutrition assistance programs. So knowing these different kind of anecdotes about passing preemption, I just decided to do a study with a colleague on trying to determine what state legislators are doing to pass preemption. It was published in American Journal of Preventive Medicine. I systematically identified the strategies by reviewing all the bills and law that went into the passage of laws for a 5-year period in the context of tobacco control, firearms, paid sick, food and nutrition policy, and LGBTQI+ civil rights. And so I did a content analysis of the bills and looked also at the passage timing and identified 5 main strategies that legislators use to pass and support preemption. And I'm going to go through each of them. But so the first one is that they pass preemptive bills quickly. So most state bills during this 5-year period pass an average of 2 to 6 months if they pass at all. Many bills are proposed that don't pass, but things that pass an average of 2 to 6 months. But there were 11 different bills or amendments that were passed within days, if not the same day that they were proposed. This is basically unheard of in legislatures at any level because there's debates. They have to have the bills in both houses match. And every state is a bicameral legislator except for Nebraska. So it's almost unheard of to have bills passed in the same day. So clearly there were some behind the scenes things going on. They were passed on the same day, 1 to 2 days, in a few days. 18 days was just like the highest number, which is also very quick. They obscured preemption by adding it to pre-existing bills on non-relevant substantive topics. They bundled preemption of multiple non-related topics. An example of this was Ohio included paid sick leave preemption with a bill that preempted preempted puppy mills. So nobody likes a puppy mill. So they added this puppy mill ban that also preempted local governments from being able to allow puppy mills. So the legislators, end up voting on 1 or 2 of the topics, but they're bundled. Another example was Hawaii had this amazing kidney dialysis bill for kidney dialysis centers, and the tobacco industry got a tobacco preemption bill added to it. I'm sorry, I meant to say Hawaii. I don't remember what state I just said, but Hawaii, I'm talking about Hawaii. And they of course passed this tobacco preemption that way. And then they titled bills in ways that don't reflect the substance of the bill. And yeah. So it makes it unclear what the legislators are voting for because they tend to not always read the bills. There's also something called single subject rules in state legislators. They're supposed to only have one subject in the bill, and all the states except for one where we found this had a single subject rule. And these bills likely violated it, but it turns out that no one actually brings challenges to the single subject rule. The whole purpose is to create transparency. So if they violate it, nothing really happens because all that basically happens is if it gets found to be violated, they just have to pass it in two separate bills. So it doesn't end up really changing the outcome. The North Carolina bathroom bill, I'm sure you heard about it in the newspaper. They used a tactic where they repealed and replaced preemption with the identical preemption. So North Carolina passed this bathroom bill that allowed required discrimination for bathrooms based only on the sex that's on somebody's birth certificate. And at the same time, it preempted civil rights protections for LGBTQI, and also it preempted paid sick leave. And there was an uproar about the bathroom bill part of it. So they took out the required discrimination and called it an act to reset, and then put in the identical preemption of civil rights and paid sick leave. So I don't think people knew that was basically just being reissued. They preempt litigation, which provides immunity to industries from lawsuits. And this is actually not only a tactic to reduce lawsuits, but actually lawsuits often create a push for more legislation and for change in the industry. The firearm industry was actually starting to make safer firearms, but then they preempted litigation against it, and it protected the firearm industry, gave them immunity from being sued, and they actually stopped. So they had the safer gun technology that they never instituted because then now the threat of litigation was gone. During our study period, we found one new firearm law like this, but just as an FYI, there were already 33 states that preempted lawsuits against the firearm industry. And there are also 26 states that preempt lawsuits against the restaurant industry for claims that the food led to diet-related disease. So there's also a federal law, just as FYI, that preempts lawsuits against the firearm industry. But that was actually passed after a lot of these state laws. Then lastly, in the context of firearms only, there's something that we call punitive preemption, and it actually allows organizations like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and also just individuals to sue local governments and even local officials who pass laws that the state that they think is preempted and they believe hurts them. And so they allow the local governments to lose federal state funding. The local officials can be removed from office. They can be subject to personal fines. And so there were 15 states that enacted this punitive preemption, which to me is unbelievably undermines local democracy to a point where I think this should be like on national news every day. So why does this matter? I mean, I hope that it's obvious that this really needs to matter, but also just historically, local governments were always innovative and came up with policy solutions that they're considered laboratories for trying different policy solutions. Here I show New York City because not only we're in New York City, but actually New York City is a leader in coming up with new policy solutions to different problems that become national law. So menu labeling with the calories, trans fat ban, and the list goes on. Another local government in California created the first Indoor Smoke-Free Air Act. So they become national, either state or national laws after being tried in local governments. Also, we elect our local officials. We want them to represent our needs. And so this is really about community self-determination, where we can, it's about local democracy, completely undermining local democracy. And then also there are major equity implications. So direct attacks on equal rights and equity by preempting civil rights statutes, sanctuary cities, minimum wage, paid sick and family leave. These create enormous health disparities and other inequities, and of course allow discrimination and negative things to happen as a result. Again, it's important to realize that local governments are really in the best position to address these types of issues like disparities and inequities, because they're usually these are present on a local level. On a state level, there's a wide range of different needs. I mean, if you think about a rural state with one, big urban city, that city is going to have different needs than the rest of the rural state. And that's where we see a lot of these types of conflicts come up. So just to not end on such a depressing note, which most of my lectures do, I'll tell you a couple things that we can do to try to counteract this. One is that we can advocate for savings clauses in state laws. So it's the opposite of preemption. They specifically allow local control and local laws. They're sometimes paired with floor preemption, but they actually, sometimes they just say that that local governments can act. So this National School Lunch Program is an example of having a savings clause that says state agencies or local agencies may impose additional restrictions on the competitive food. So it provided national standards, which is the minimum standards we talked about, but there's also a savings clause that expressly allows state and local control. Also, advocates who care about, pretty much any issue these days, most advocates focus on the issue and passing laws to support the issue, but they're really not so focused on fighting against preemption. And frankly, it needs to be part and parcel to any policy activity. Some colleagues who work at a nonprofit center called Grassroots Change created this countering and preventing preemption strategy. And if you look at the top left, I think one of the most important things that legislators and advocates and practitioners need to realize is that preemption is always on the table when it comes to the industry, but people in public health it's not in their mind. So it's not something that they're prepared to fight against. So basically, we should always be expecting preemption because it's always on the table on the other side. Engaging grassroots and other advocacy groups on the topic of preemption is important. Using media communications to talk about preemption, not using the term preemption, that definitely doesn't work. Also, frankly, it seems like it's a partisan issue. It can be a partisan issue, but it's sometimes not a partisan issue. So you saw California passed, but that's a very long story, how California ended up with a soda tax, but a preemption. But it does happen in every state. You saw the firearm preemption. There are some states that, you might be surprised that they have preemption. So it's important to use kind of more, not think of this only as a partisan issue, because of course that can turn off a large segment of the population. When people across the aisle value local control. And then the other thing is to really make sure that when you're working with groups that you agree on what compromises you're willing to give up on preemption, because often the industry will propose something with preemption as part of the compromise for the legislation. So if you're going to agree to some very weak, very lame legislation with preemption, you really are creating a regulatory void anyway. There was an example of before Obama was president, there was a very weak national school lunch federal bill that was proposed, very weak, and it had preemption. And we were really pushing the advocates not to agree to this because it would have established a nationwide soda in every school, basically. And like very luckily it didn't pass, and then under the Obama administration they passed a much stronger one. So sometimes it's hard to like wait out and see if you're going to get better law, but you know, that would have been pretty much a nightmare to have that law in place. So thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions and comments.
Thank you, Ms. Pomerantz, for the really broad presentation. We saw quite a breadth of policies. So now it's the Q&A part. You are really welcome to put your questions in the chat. We already have a comment, or raise your hand. I see Dr. Neal is ready to fire questions and comments. You're welcome to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat, and then whoever raises first, I will go by that order. So Dr. Neal, go ahead.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. So it seems like most of the examples of preemption that you gave throughout the talk really stack up very clearly along kind of partisan lines, where you have a conservative state government basically preventing more liberal, typically city governments, you know, from passing more liberal policies. I guess I'm curious, are there examples, or are there, you know, very few, if you have any examples of things working the other way around?
Oh, the other, well, the other, do you mean the other way, like the Oregon sanctuary state law, like meaning it was used for good, or just?
Yeah, I mean, so what? Yeah, I mean, I know you had mentioned cases of minimum standards. I guess those apply, but I'm thinking more. I don't know. Is there ever a case, for example, where a state government passes tighter restrictions on firearms and, you know, preempts local governments who might have wanted to ease those restrictions, for example?
Yeah, so I can answer in two ways too. I did review for another paper. I reviewed only 6 states savings clauses for firearms, and I did find Maryland has a very interesting mix of preemption and substantive policy, and Maryland did have one. It's very rare, by the way. The answer is yes, but it's rare. Maryland had an example of a law that said that local governments could not prohibit safety training for firearms. So that was like an example of what you're saying, where they said they couldn't prohibit it. So it was used for good, but also they have a lot of state laws and preemption laws. The example of California, which I also saw in the chat, was a question and kind of along your lines. You're right. Like, I'm not going to deny that this is not mostly partisan in the exact way that you just described, where it's more of a conservative state legislator and a progressive local governments. And especially, there's even very good evidence that there is some, you know, race things going on for minimum wage in white legislators in cities that are predominantly Black. And so that's clear. The example of California is just worth mentioning because it wasn't actually the Democratic legislator just preempting out of its own desire. The beverage industry had threatened to put a measure on the ballot that would have prohibited local governments from ever passing a tax, which would be completely destructive to a local government. They can't have that happen. And given the concern that voters wouldn't understand to vote against that, the legislator agreed to soda tax preemption for, I think it's 10 years, in exchange for the beverage industry not putting that ballot initiative on. I mean, that's a terrible story, but you know, that's how the most liberal state in America got preemption of soda taxes. Maurizio, hi.
Hello. Thank you so much.
One quick comment.
What?
One quick comment. If you could put up the contact info again, people are interested in that.
Oh, sure.
The last slide.
Sure.
And
what if I put it in the chat? I'll put my email in the chat. I want to see Maurizio's face.
No, just to understand, like how much people know about these preemptions, like regular people, the general public? And how much?
Niente. They don't know anything. Niente.
Zero, right?
Zero. People do not know about preemption. So there is a group, Local Solution Support Center, who does tons of work to try to understand what people know and how to educate people. And they really find people don't know about preemption. And also what's interesting is that when they talk to, Republicans used to be all about local control, right? That used to be their platform. And the Republican legislators that they talked to also kind of admitted that it depends on the topic, right? But the voters don't seem to get any of these nuances because also preemption is just not a great word. Like it's a very technical, wonky word. So people don't know about it. The New York Times did one article on this food policy preemption, and then it's really almost never picked up. So I think that's one of the biggest problems, frankly, is that no one really knows about it. I think paid sick leave preemption was picked up a little, but like I did a ton of firearms preemption work, and it's doesn't even get picked up.
Okay. So it's a very sneaky way to do things.
Well, that's what everything about preemption is sneaky.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
And there is one question. There's one comment and one question in the chat by Georgia Silvera Siemens. I hope I didn't butcher the name.
The first one. I think I answered the first one. The concerns about the midterm elections. Well, I guess preempting abortion is one of the big topics that are coming up. We can, but this is just, I can't say the elections have any difference than this is a concern always. So I don't know how to answer that too much. I mean, I think just every topic you care about is on the hit list of for preemption. You as in like literally everything any individual cares about, right, is always going to be on the hit list for preemption if there's any entity that opposes it. Chris,
and you're very welcome to unmute yourself and ask too. And there are two comments by Chris Novel.
Hi, and thank you very much, Jennifer. You've provided a great deal of insight on this topic. You had mentioned about how it was not practical for aviation to have state level laws because of the nature of flying. However, as far as people being mobile on the ground, I noticed going back several years, and I don't know what the state laws are at this point, that, and not that it's a good idea, but when driving, say from New York to Florida, that with every state having different cell phone laws, you could literally, be legal one moment and not legal the next. And then other forms of being mobile, some people work in one state and live in another. So there's all those kinds of real world situations. So I want to make that comment.
Well, can I just say one quick thing, that the firearm industry uses what you just said as their justification for preemption, because they say, how do you know if you're going to have an illegal gun, which frankly, the whole country is basically gun friendly. So they pretend that these gun owners are going to be arrested for doing legal things because they say, oh, the law changes so rapidly. But in reality, it doesn't for the guns. I mean, unless you're out shooting in the streets, you're usually abiding by the gun laws. But so that's actually that's the argument the industry uses for preemption, is that it's hard to deal with. They call it a patchwork of local laws.
The other thing, and I remember skimming through a book, and it overlaps a little bit with your topic. You may be familiar. I'll try my best to describe it. The book was about how with federal laws, the people that vote on the federal laws often do not read through the entire law. And so even though it gets passed, it results in the paid government employees being the ones who have to administer those laws. And basically that was not, the implication is that that was not a good situation.
I worked for a US senator, and that was definitely the case, that the aides read the laws and the senator never read one law. So I think that's 100% accurate.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
And if I could briefly add to that, it's often that, at least to the best of my experience, the ADs also see the local organizers, right? It's not rare that the senator may not have time. We saw that when we did some organizing when I was a PhD student. We got a few senators that we would meet, but then most of the times it was, their staff. So
well, that's what I was, a college intern, and I was the person who met with every organizer who cared about health. I didn't know anything. I knew nothing. And I was the person who the senator had me meet with them. I felt terrible, but you see how little that senator cared about health. Yes.
One quick question, and everyone is really welcome to share more questions either in the chat or through here. There was this, I don't remember in the introduction slides, that pitted essentially the idea of profit versus protection. If you could comment, because for example, say when we're looking at equitable development of electric vehicle infrastructure, right? There is sort of, if we're looking at equitable development, then it's more costly in the short term. So it's less profitable in the short term because maybe there isn't the electricity grid infrastructure there to support that, but it could be profitable in the long term if someone steps in, for example, the government, to pick up the investment and lay out that plan. So I wonder if when it comes to public health issues, there is sort of a similar synergy, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, that also could be used in the public discourse.
I mean, yes, you're right. We try to show how so there was a few examples where, LGBTQ civil rights discrimination is a good example, is like discriminating against workers, which Arkansas did. And, it actually does hurt having less diversity in the workplace. But nobody, I hate to say it, but like no one seems to care. And like paid sick leave, there's definite evidence on the economic benefits of having paid sick leave. And how about even family leave? I mean, there's definite benefits in the long run, but I don't know, something about American commercialism is so far on like the edge of the profit that I don't know that they'd see the long-term benefits. It seems like a very American value, right? To be quick hits of what you're looking for. But I think it's worth maybe writing a whole paper on long-term benefits to be thinking about for all the public health issue. Thank you.
Or maybe a design issue, a market design or other issue that would incentivize incorporating long-term profit, long-term benefits into the short-term decision-making.
Yeah.
That's what maybe an economist would say. Okay. Any more questions? If there aren't any, I mean, it was, we have a comment in the chat. I can read it out loud for the people who cannot see it. Terry Matthews says, there is tendency in academic work focusing on other issues such as sustainability and resiliency, which require infrastructure to implement, to focus on local governments, especially cities, without understanding the broad state-level regulatory schemes, sometimes required by federal law, that have preemptive impacts. Since infrastructure requires finance, which is also regulated by state laws, there is a need to focus academic work on the state regulatory schemes apart from preemption. Focus on states is needed for policy objectives that span local jurisdictional boundaries. Do you have a comment on state versus local?
I see this. I got my master's 2021, and I'm technically a PhD student in the urban systems, but I also work for New York City, and I have a research program. And you know, I know preemption because I work in New York City, and it's a very interesting topic. And I was interested in, you know, your take on it. I mean, there are reasons for federal preemption. There are reasons for state preemption. You know, the way you look at it is very interesting, and I don't think it's untrue. Truly, I get that. But you know, this is Tandon, yes. We're all about infrastructure, and we're all about sustainability, and we're all about this and that. And everyone focuses on cities like they can do everything. We can't finance everything. We're not responsible for everything. And, you know, apart from the political stuff, the states do regulate. I mean, you know, just in New York State, we have this fabulous regulatory scheme called beneficial use designation. I'm getting into the infrastructure stuff. And nobody seems to realize that, you know, cities, the preemption, you said nobody understands preemption. Absolutely true. But then the academics keep focusing on cities, on stuff. And when I talk about stuff, I'm talking about infrastructure. It's finance. It's construction law. It's, oh, let's not even get into construction law because that's the state courts, you know, interpreting state law. So all I'm saying is the focus on state regulatory schemes is kind of missing in a lot of areas. And if you keep focusing on cities, like, you know, they can do everything, we're just going to be missing the place to address, you know, sort of the issues that span jurisdiction. I mean, the environment spans jurisdictional boundaries, right? So, and anyway, that was just my thought that I think for people in the infrastructure related field, you know, we got to stop thinking about cities all the time because they can't do everything. So that was my 2 cents.
I think I just want to say that this cusp is about city urban progress. Maybe you're just in the wrong section for your interests.
No. I'm saying, yeah, I know all about CUSP, and God love them, you know. You know, when the smart city thing came out years ago, you know, it was this idea of, you know, think globally, act locally, which, you know, is not a bad way to go. But at the end of the day, cities cannot do what the academic sort of focus expects them to do.
So if I could jump in, and I'm sorry to interrupt, and maybe rephrase this a little bit. If we maybe one idea is, how does the state level policies sort of interact with the city level? I mean, yeah, there is always, I think state level focus is focusing on state level, and policy spillovers is definitely an issue. I can see that, and I think there is quite some work. I remember, at least from my PhD at Johns Hopkins, there were people there that were doing a lot of work on state and federal policies and even global policies. So if I could maybe rephrase it for the particular speaker, what would be the interplay in the local government preemption work that you shared? What would be interplays with state policies that could either enhance or that we could have synergies or competition between cities and states?
I think the problem is, well, I don't work in infrastructure and I don't do any research on infrastructure, but for every topic that I showed you, I have done substantial work on. And the problem is really that the majority of states are taking away the authority of local governments and not acting. So what we're seeing is a regulatory void. So Terry, I love that you're seeing that states like New York have like these major infrastructure bills, but in public health, we don't see that. We don't see states enacting laws that are protecting the citizens. And so it is left to the local governments to fill in those blanks. And then when the state removes the authority of local governments to act and then does not act on its own, that's really scary from a public health, safety, and social justice perspective.
I understand. I like I said, I started out life as a municipal bond attorney. So like this is how I know about this area, which is why I was interested in hearing about it from another perspective. But and I recognize some of the names on the call. It's just as a student at NYU, I just see this gap, and in the field, you know, the environmental sustainability field, there's just such a lack of understanding of cities in the context of states. And when states enact, you know, wide-ranging, you know, environmental laws, finance laws, by definition, they are preempting local action, which I think is actually a good thing in the area of physical infrastructure, because you want it to be statewide to capture, you know, the externalities that you can't. If New York City did everything everyone thinks it can do, you know.
So Terry, if you could maybe summarize it in 2 seconds, because I see people need to leave.
I think CUSP and Wagner and Tandon, they need to look at this issue in the context of infrastructure and focus the students on, it's not just the cities, they need to understand the states. Okay.
Thank you, Terry.
So you're welcome.
Thank you for the comment. Thank you, everyone.
Good to see you all.
For joining today.
Thank you. Bye.
That was fun. Bye.
And thank you, Ms. Pomerantz, again for joining us today.
It was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you, everyone, in our next seminar.